Oh, hello YouTube. Okay, so today's video I'm just going to be going through and summarising the important information in a book called Factfulness, written by Hans Rosling. But before I go through the information in the book and explain to you what the book is about, I want to ask you two questions, okay? Question 1. How has the level of absolute poverty changed in the last 20 years in the world? Absolute poverty being like real poverty, so like people actually starving, so like people being in real trouble. Okay, so how has the level of absolute poverty changed in the last 20 years? Option A, doubled. Option B, no change. Option C, halved. Okay, so choose A, B or C. Okay, question 2. What percentage of 1-year-old infants are receiving vaccinations in the world? Okay, so what proportion of children are able to receive basic medicine like vaccines in the world? Option A, 20%. Option B, 50%. Option C, nearly all the children, 80%. Okay, hopefully you've had time to think. The answer to both these questions are option C, but the majority of the people answered option A or option B. Only the minority of the people, I think literally around 10 to 20% of the people answered option C. Essentially, Hans, in this book, uses these two questions to kind of illustrate that most of us have like a negative perception, like a negative bias over the current worldly events and the way the world is developing. Most of us always seem to perceive things as going badly, when actually, this is what he tries to communicate over in his book, that when you look at the data, the actual figures, the world is definitely improving in terms of poverty and, you know, other aspects of the world as well. And he kind of says there's a couple of reasons why we tend to have like a bias on things and why we get these questions like these wrong. One is a negative bias put on the news. Okay, so I think we all know this. Generally, events on information they provide on the news tend to be a bit kind of one end of the spectrum or the other. They tend to be quite extreme and quite negative views, mainly because that's grabs people's attention. So like, for example, it's much easier to get people's attention if you talk about a massive plane crash which killed lots of people, rather than doing a news article about how the rates of accidents with planes have decreased significantly over the last 5 years, which I believe they have. So that's one reason. Another one is just kind of our perception. So this is quite obvious, but where we grow up is going to drive quite a lot of what our perceptions on our perspective. But obviously the world is completely different. So when you try and use our perspectives without looking at the data and without doing research on other countries, other environments, they don't work and they don't apply anymore. Another reason is that quite a lot of time our educators, which might be our parents or might be school, their information is based on information which is like 20 years or 10 years old, but the world has developed so quickly over the last years, most of those principles don't apply anymore, hence you really need to look at the data. And essentially what Factfulness, the book, in this book, Hans actually basically breaks down quite a lot of the biases we have and uses the data analysis to actually illustrate what the facts of the world are. And basically I'm just going to cover the most important points and most important key takeaways from this book now. Okay, so the first point is the concept of poverty in the world. What he basically says in the book is that actually poverty levels have dramatically improved since I think 1975 he compares it to, and actually the absolute poverty in the world, countries in real poverty, it's only actually 9% of the population now. So only 9% of the population are actually in absolute poverty, are actually starving. That's a significant improvement in the last few decades, but most people don't know this because it's never picked up on the news. Another point he talks about, this is like the second most important point I believe, he talks about the population. So a common thing which I think tends to come up on the news and a common perception people believe is that the population is increasing too fast. So like the population has increased dramatically due to human developments over the last few decades, and we're around 9 billion now, and I think the perception is that it's going to keep on increasing at the rate it's currently increasing, and then we're going to end up in a situation where there's going to be more pollution, resources are going to start running out due to overpopulation, and then the kind of world's going to implode and just fold in on itself because it's not sustainable. But in reality, when you actually look at the data, Hans does a data analysis, and when you actually look at the data, what you'll find is actually that the projections for the population of the world in around 2040, it's going to start curving off, and actually it's going to hit around between 10 to 12 billion, so average 11 billion, and it's going to stop there. And this isn't just analysis done by Hans, this is generally accepted regarded with data analysts of the population. This is, and actually the logic behind this is really simple as well. So when you see the population in developed countries like the UK, US, Japan, you'll see that actually the population does actually start to curve off, and actually the population is decreasing in some cases. Like in Japan, they have a significant issue with the lack of births. And the reason for this is simple. It's because when a country is developing, they need to give birth to lots of children. And there's a couple of reasons for this, but mainly that when you're developing, quite a lot of that income comes from like labour and like agriculture. So you need the labour force, you need the children to be able to provide that labour. And also, as parents grow old and they can't work anymore, there's no like pensions or kind of safety net systems in place, so they need the children to look after them. Particularly in the really poor countries, another issue is that quite a lot of time the children end up dying, hence you need to give birth to more children historically to be able to make sure there's some still left, to put it in a bit of a crude term. But obviously, when you become developed and the country becomes developed, which we're seeing in quite a lot of countries, there's no need for that anymore. Hence, the population starts to stabilise. And it's important to bear this in mind. So there's all this kind of like apocalyptic rhetoric about the population increasing so much and we being in trouble in the next 10 years or so. But that is not the case when you actually look at the data. And if you want further information, you can refer to this book, Factfulness, and it will give you more of the details. But here I'm just giving you a bit of a summary. I think the last point of the book, which really struck me from the book and which is really interesting, is the kind of the convergence of religion and cultures due to wealth. So, you know, we all want to be PC and everything, but I think I'm guilty of it maybe sometimes as well, and I'm sure most people are. When you see people from different cultures or different backgrounds or different religions and they do something strange or do something dangerous or bad, we have a tendency, humans, you know, as a species have a tendency to just say, kind of treat people being differently or treat people differently or, you know, class people differently because of their culture or religion. It's like, so let's say maybe you had like a whole bunch of people who are making like a racket or, you know, lots of noise, and they're like tourists, and then you say, oh, for God's sake, of course they would be doing that because they're from this country or they've built this religion or whatever. But essentially what Hans says is, when you actually look at the data, it's not culture or religions which really set people apart, it's the amount of wealth which make people act differently. And this is easily confirmable by looking at the data of the past, of the way people from developed countries now, so like countries like US, Japan, UK, to what they actually used to be when they were developing. So a really good example of this is Japan. So Japan started becoming much more wealthy in like the 1960s, 70s when the economy was in a big boom. And when they first started developing, they started to be able to travel to different countries using air travel because the population became more wealthier. And at the time they had a really bad image to other countries because of the loud noises and like the impolite manners they had when they visited other countries. But now when you think about Japanese people and Japanese tourists, I think quite a lot of time there's kind of like the bias, a positive bias, that they actually tend to be very nice and very polite people. But obviously the religion hasn't changed in those 30, 40 years. Still the majority of people are Buddhists, and the culture really hasn't changed that much fundamentally either. What has changed is the amount of wealth they have. And maybe, so essentially their actions have changed that because of their economy, they're more wealthy, I suppose that their personalities change, if you will. And basically, when you actually look at the data, that's similar with loads of other countries as well. When the countries become more and more developed, their attitudes and the way they act change along with wealth. So what defines a person's or a culture or a population's actions isn't necessarily just their religion or culture, or like most of us believe it to be or perceive it to be, but it's actually the amount of wealth they have. And it's very important to bear that in mind, because it actually makes it much easier, because once you know that, it means that when you're interacting with other people from different cultures, different backgrounds, you'll know that they're actually basically the same kind of person, you know, deep down. Okay, so I think those are the three main points which are covered in the book, which I think are very important. Maybe last point I'd like to put into perspective, which is also quite a useful piece of information, useful takeaway from the book. there's a bit where Hans says, basically, he does like the presentation of this information, and he proves it. He shows all the data to all these investors in like an investor meeting. He says, at the moment, the population is kind of split in terms of ratio between 1 America, 1 Europe, 1 Africa, and 4 Asia. So essentially, Asia accounts for around 50% of the population, and each of the other continents account for around 12.5% of the population. And it's set in the current way development is going, the amount of the population in Africa and Asia is going to continue increasing, and the Europe and American population is going to start just kind of like declining, slightly declining. So when you think about the fact that Asia and Africa are going to actually develop in terms of economies, that's what the data is actually illustrated. This isn't just some kind of wild theory. They are going to develop and even reach a similar development stage to America and Europe. That's literally what the data is showing. And you think, and you realise that the majority of the population is Asia and Africa. It's pretty obvious to any idiot that it's best to invest in those continents, because obviously there's more population and there's more development in those countries. But at the end of the presentation, after giving all the data and providing all this information, essentially an investor came up to Manny and told Hans, well, sure, this data and everything is interesting, but because of the culture in Africa, there's no way this is going to stick. There's no way that there's going to be any, that Africa is going to be a good place to perform investments. And this really shocked the author, and it kind of illustrates how ingrained into our brains and into the way our society works, these kind of like these biases before cultural differences, because the data clearly illustrates that it's wealth that is really causes the cultural those kind of like differences between people. It's not the culture and it's not religion, but besides all that information, people still choose to believe it. You know, it doesn't take long, and when you actually look at the figures, it doesn't take long to figure this out. But it kind of really does bring into perspective that it's really important to understand the data and look at the actual information, because so much of what we do and so much of the way our economy and society works is driven by those kind of biased perspectives. And if we're able to curve that and, you know, act rationally, and well, I suppose data rationally, we would be able to actually improve our lives and also the lives of the society as a whole. So we would be able to actually invest in things which are going to provide us more returns, and maybe we can think about our careers and the way we want to live our lives in a way which is actually beneficial for the world and for us as well. Okay. Well, anyway, I'll put a link in the bottom of this video for the full for further information on this book. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed the video.